Good morning, church.
Good morning.
Our gospel passage this morning is from Mark's Gospel, the 9th chapter. I'm going to start reading in verse 30 and go on through verse 37. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another, who was the greatest. He sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I want to begin this morning by thanking you, Hazel Christian Church, for inviting Paul and me to come over this morning. You know, mostly Paul and I don't get to travel together in the mornings. He has another church commitment on Sundays, and not everybody is smart enough to understand that they should invite him. He's the better part of the deal when I come to visit. But mainly I want to thank you for joining in the work of Galileo Church over the last couple of years of our existence. We're only a little over 2 years old now. And what that means is that Hazel Christian Church has been a consistent supporter of this mission effort in the southern suburbs of the Metroplex to reach spiritual refugees. And I am so appreciative to you as a congregation for understanding the import of that work and for joining in with your whole hearts in that effort that we're making down there. And especially grateful for Alan's encouragement along the way. He's one of my first colleagues to kind of catch the vision of what might happen if we really went all in with Galileo Church down there. And I am just incredibly grateful for his vision and support and for the encouragement of this whole church body. Thank you. Thank you. Please, if you don't hear anything else, if it's time now for your nap, that's okay. But have heard me say that we are grateful, and I come with the greetings and the gratitude of Galileo Church on my lips. The gospel text that I read this morning from Mark is from the Revised Common Lectionary, and I'm not entirely sure if you've been following that schedule of readings. Sometimes, okay. So you've been reading through the Gospel of Mark at different points over the last year, and maybe with some regularity over the summer, and not even knowing whether you would be caught up with Mark's Gospel along with other churches this fall. I chose to go with that text today because, honestly, of my own interest lately in how the church, and particularly how those of us who grew up in church and who find our identity in church and who feel so much at home in church, have fallen into a trap that Jesus has been trying to help us out of for such a long time. Here's what I think it is. Because we've been having this conversation for a long time now about the decline of the church. And I'm not talking about your congregation here specifically. I'm talking about wider than that. And I'm not even just talking about the Christian church, Disciples of Christ, although as a denomination we have experienced serious decline in the last little while in terms of the numbers of congregations and the numbers of persons who affiliate with us and how many of those persons actually show up to be counted on a Sunday morning. Maybe you have experienced some of that yourselves. But I'll tell you, it's wider than that even. The continent of North America, literally, is experiencing a serious decline in religious affiliation and worship attendance, beginning with mainline Protestants such as ourselves and extending over the last decade or so to our evangelical siblings as well. All the lines are trending down, some of them faster than others. That is the reality. And we have been wringing our hands over the data that fully 35% of young adults in their 20s in this country, 35% are simply not interested in the religious institutions of their parents and grandparents, or frankly, any institutions of their parents and grandparents. And maybe for you, it is not just the abstraction of the data that worries you. Maybe, like me, you have one or two or several of those young adults in your own life. They are your beloveds, and you want to feel sure that they will find a spiritual home in a church that will bring them as much comfort and joy as your belonging here has brought to you. Yes? Well, as you know, Galileo Church and I are working on exactly that, in part because I feel so confident that the church I love can stretch and bend into new forms for new generations, if we will let it, so that we will not leave more than a third of our kids and our grandkids without a form of community life to support their fragile faith that God is still working in their lives and in the life of the world. In short, Azle Christian Church, we want the same thing, you and me. We want the church to live. You want that up here in Azle, and I want that down there in Mansfield. And we have our reasons for wanting that, and most of them are good reasons. But as Jesus and his disciples talk together in Mark's 9th chapter, I feel like Jesus keeps kind of cutting his eyes over at me just to make sure I'm actually listening. And he gestures with his chin toward Peter and James and John and all the rest just to make sure that I'm paying attention to them. And he asks them loud enough so that I can hear, what were you arguing about on the way here? Not like he doesn't know the answer, right? I mean, Jesus has the supernatural hearing of a mother waiting for her teenager to come home after curfew late on a Saturday night. You cannot get anything past him. But here he is asking them, what did you argue about on the way here? Because I think he just wants to hear them say it out loud. But they're embarrassed. They don't want to say it out loud. So they keep their mouths shut tight, and I think if Mark had known how to write it down in ancient Greek, he might have portrayed them as shrugging their shoulders and saying, which everybody knows is what you say when you don't want to lie, but you know you've been caught red-handed, right? And what these disciples don't want to say out loud is that they've been arguing about something about which we know plenty. Who is the greatest? Now, that had to be an ugly conversation. I'm actually conjuring a mental picture right now of those 11 Republican candidates on that platform the other night. During that presidential primary debate, I mean, they were just one short of 12, yeah? And they were very noisy in their efforts to be recognized as the greatest, or at least higher in the ranks than 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 of the group. And at this early stage, really, they don't have to win, they just have to not lose. And Jesus' disciples, what noisy form did their argument take? It's kind of funny because there's not actually a lot of status involved in being Jesus' roadies, unless you like rubbing elbows with lots of sick people and serving food to hungry people. Although maybe they did like that. I mean, these followers of his were people of low status. Before Jesus called their names, they were fishermen, the uneducated, low-wage workers of their day. They were tax collectors, despised by their Roman employers and their Jewish neighbors. They were women whose names nobody but Jesus ever bothered to learn. Diane. So they argued among themselves about which one of them was best suited to this new line of work, the care and management of the reign of God, overseers of the Holy Spirit, spin doctors and image consultants for Jesus himself. I mean, isn't that kind of how they imagined themselves? Jesus had told them back in chapter 8 that pretty soon his time would be up, The controversies with religious and civil authorities that had been simmering were finally going to boil over, and that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed. And after 3 days rise again. And his his disciples, just shook their heads and told him, don't talk like that. People don't want to hear that. So a couple days later, in chapter 9, he tells them again, the second time, that's the one we read, as plainly as he can. And they just pretend they don't understand what he's saying. I mean, they are themselves like children with their fingers in their ears, pretending not to hear. Na, 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 na. He's going to tell them again for a third time in chapter 10, 8, 9, and 10. And again, they will prove to be as dull as a sack of hammers in their refusal to acknowledge that this path he's on leads to serious opposition and eventual inevitable death. Because like all of us, like all 11 of those presidential candidates taking jabs at each other, the disciples want to win, or at least not to lose. And if you die, well, you lose. So Jesus, here in chapter 9, like any good teacher would, looks for a way to make his point plain. First, he reminds them of something they have surely heard him say 1,000,000 times. It is the only rule, really, for those who are on this perpetual road trip with him. If you want to be first, he says, which I love because it means he understands this about us, that we do like to win, that we all like to be at the front of every line, that we are wired by generations of evolutionary biology to prioritize self-preservation above all else. Jesus knows. If you want to be first, then make yourself last. Make yourself small. Go to the end of the line. Look for a way to be useful to somebody else. Humble yourself. Think less about what you want and more about what somebody else needs. If you want to be first, and I know you do, then be last. Got it? And I imagine he looked around at his little audience, and like any good teacher would, he recognized that the lesson wasn't quite sinking in yet. So he scanned the house with his eyes, hoping for some better way to make his point. Some people had brought their kids along with them that day on their Messiah-seeking excursion. And now I'm not imagining that these kids were the kind with neat, clean clothing and matching socks and their hair combed down all smooth and their eyes sparkling with imagination and humor. I'm imagining that these kids were, in the first place, from poor families, where poor nutrition and poor hygiene were the everyday norm. I'm imagining, in fact, that they suffered from malnutrition and had persistent, deep coughs, like the kind that can make a toddler sound like someone who's been smoking for 40 years. I imagine that if you stood close enough, you could see the headlights they kept scratching at. I'm imagining that the kids in the house with Jesus that afternoon were the ones whose parents felt like it just might be worth it to follow him around for a couple of days in hopes of a miracle of healing, or even better, a miracle of health for kids whose chances of making it through to a healthy adulthood were ever so small. It's to one of those kids that Jesus gestures, one of those frail, phlegmy, forlorn children, and brings him close to his embrace. And he says to his disciples, it's like this. See? Now, we are used to the idea that Jesus occasionally told us that to enter his kingdom, we ourselves would have to become like little children. And he will, in fact, say that in Mark chapter 10. Let the little children come to me, he'll say, for it is to such as these that the reign of God belongs. And to some extent, we have romanticized this idea, thinking of our own healthy, red-cheeked, fat little babies who are innocent and beautiful and don't know yet how to hurt our feelings with ingratitude and indifference. Maybe you can tell that I am the mom of 2 teenagers. They are not so old, though, that I can't remember how sweet they were when they were little. I know what I'm talking about. We sort of like to think of ourselves in that way, right? Childlike and pure and expectant and holding out our hands to receive good gifts from our Heavenly Father, with Jesus as our big brother, the one who keeps us safe and shows us the ropes. But in this passage from Mark 9, please notice that Jesus is not encouraging his followers to become childlike. He is saying instead that he cannot think of a better example of how to become last of all than by welcoming children. Because when we welcome children, we are welcoming Jesus. And when we welcome Jesus, we are welcoming God. It is not we who are meant to be like little children, at least in this telling. It is Jesus who is like a child. It is God's own self who is waiting to be cared for. In this example, we are meant to humble ourselves by serving the most humble one of all. Now, I confess that this messes with my head. We prefer our Jesus strong and making decisions from a deep well of mature self-determination. It might even be fair to say that we like our Jesus resurrected. After all the trouble is over, his life no longer endangered by even the worst things that human beings could think of to do to each other. But on this afternoon, with these disciples arguing which among them is number one, he begs us to see him another way, to see him small, to see him too tired to walk anymore and in need of being carried, to see him aching with hunger pangs and unable to get his own dinner, to see him as completely and utterly dependent on our willingness to get up from in front of the TV or the laptop and tend to his crying, to lose count of the stinky diapers and the sippy cups, the homework assignments left till too late, and the soccer games that take up every weekend hour, to see him in this inverted relationship of power and powerlessness, himself in need of our care and help, we the givers, he the taker. Now, of course, it is not Jesus himself who ultimately needs these things from the likes of us. On one level, he's simply giving us an easy way to do what he's asking. We can position ourselves rightly toward the reign of God by taking care of those who cannot care for themselves. And so it starts at home with our own kids and grandkids, so that our consistently selfless parenting and grandparenting can be seen as a spiritual practice that draws us near to God's heart. Parenting, grandparenting, as a spiritual practice that draws you near to the heart of God, so that stinky diapers and sippy cups and homework assignments and soccer games actually become a form of prayer. And it extends to the kids of our church, so that whenever Amanda comes and asks you to sign up to teach Sunday school for the first and second graders, you're going to know that you'll be teaching Jesus himself. Whenever you volunteer at Vacation Bible School or carry kids to camp in your car, it's like you're doing that for the Lord. And from there we can learn to think of our whole lives, actually, as being in service to the generations that will come after us. In what ways does my job serve the children of my community? In what ways do my consumer practices leave a better or worse world for coming generations? How do I spend my vote on behalf of the frail, flinty, forlorn kids around the globe so that everybody's children have a chance at health and happiness? It would be entirely in keeping with Jesus' teaching here to think completely literally about how caring for actual children is like caring for God's own self. God is that invested in the lives of the children God gives to the world. God identifies with them completely. God expects us to find our way to God's heart by welcoming children into our lives. But as with so many things Jesus says, we can go deeper than the literal implications of his teachings. He's also trying to tell us, is he not, that losing is not the worst thing that will ever happen to us. That the downward trending line of our church, the inevitable decline of our lives and our life together are not really the destruction we so much dread. As he progresses toward Jerusalem in the second half of Mark's gospel, as he tries to warn his closest friends that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better, isn't he trying to get them to see that if they stick with him, it is inevitable that they too will suffer loss and pain? They, like him, will encounter danger and the threat of extinction. They will know what it feels like to lie awake at night wondering whether any of the things they love will still be around come morning or come the next generation. The life with Jesus way is not a way that guarantees success and #winning. Not for him, it wasn't. And not for us. So I am here as your missionary to the southern suburbs of the Metroplex, confessing to you that I am learning slowly, little by little, to adjust my own thinking about what it would mean for, say, Galileo Church to live or die, succeed or fail. And for me to enjoy a long and fruitful season of ministry as its planter pastor, or not. I really don't know what is the right goal when I stay up late at night talking it over with Jesus, because he just keeps grabbing kids, my kids, your kids, kids that are way more frail and flimmy and forlorn than ours, and making me look. He keeps reminding me that all he's asking us to do is take care of the ones who can't quite take care of themselves yet. Just grow them up. Just teach them how to serve the next generation, and so on. And the winning, the surviving, the greatness, the living, the dying, the resurrection, well, that's his job. He'll take care of that if we just keep taking care of our kids. Thanks be to God.